CASAT Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to Season 4 of CASAT Conversations. I am your host, Heather Haslam. This season, we will explore the impact of trauma on those who work in human services. You'll hear from researchers, authors, and people with lived experience. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Today, we are joined by Dr. Steve Rose, a researcher, sociologist, and addiction counselor. Welcome, Steve. We're happy to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So as we get started, I'd love for you to share really about yourself, your story, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so what I do today is primarily addiction counseling. But historically, as you mentioned, I was a researcher, particularly in the field of sociology. And my research was on veterans in transition to civilian life, a topic we'll probably be touching upon quite a bit today. And at the core of, I guess, what I do now and my historical research is really the power of social connections. And that's relevant in the addiction field. Often people will say the opposite of addiction is connection in many ways. And also from a sociological perspective, I was looking at issues that were often framed in psychological terms, but there was an underlying social component to it that I saw that was kind of missing from mainstream discussions of trauma. And so, yeah, that's kind of an overview of what I'm doing now, what I did then, and kind of the underlying theme of the interaction between the individual and society as being core to that.
I'm curious, how does your sociology background inform, what you do now on an individual level with your counseling practice?
Well, it's recognizing people not as just individuals, but as parts of broader systems. And how those broader systems really affect them and create inner systems. So I guess it's like psychology we can look at. I know internal family systems therapy really delves into it on quite a deep level of inner parts of us that are interacting to create our thoughts, emotions, and actions. But these things don't just appear in a vacuum. They are produced by social contexts, and you can look at different levels of that context. So it could be one's interpersonal relations, one's systems in a family, systems in a community, or a society kind of broadly, or a particular institution. And there's all of these different levels of analysis that are relevant in understanding a person and what's driving, what's underlying their behavior. And I think having this kind of holistic way of looking at it kind of lends itself to a trauma-informed, a form of compassion. It makes it more natural to come to that mindset because you can see kind of all of the things that are playing into this person's behavior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like sometimes we get so narrowed on the individual and what's going on that we forget that they're part of the larger society and there's so much playing a role within that.
Right,
or the culture that they're existing in, whatever that is, like veterans per se.
Yeah. And in the institution, which we can for sure get into. But,
Cool. So I know in the beginning of your career as an academic sociologist, you developed a concept called transitional injury, really as a way to explain suicidal ideation among Canadian veterans. Can you share with us more about this concept?
Yeah, when we think of veterans issues, and particularly around the time when I was doing this research, 2015 was when I graduated, so it was more of a topic of discussion because a lot of veterans were coming back from Afghanistan in the years prior to that. And the topic of social integration, transition to civilian life, was really a big thing back then. Still is a relevant thing, but it was really big back then when it was happening. And the research had tended to focus on it because I did scoping reviews as part of kind of my research as well, to in the summer, just to publish like what's the literature in the veterans field in general, and kind of summarizing all of the literature related to veterans transition issues. And so kind of got a really meta level look at this in terms of a summary of what's being published. And the vast majority of the literature being published on veterans issues was from a psychological perspective, particularly focused on PTSD. And it was from the kind of lens of more of an individualistic lens, which of course is necessary. And as someone who's a counselor, I draw upon this research too. But it was very much looking at veterans as individual units that were traumatized in war, and they come back to civilian life, and now we have to heal the war traumas. And so war is bad, civilian life good, and it was kind of that way of looking at it. When I was talking to veterans in my research, I was getting a very different sense that a lot of them were saying something actually quite the opposite. They would say, war was hell, but civilian life was worse. And they didn't just necessarily mean that it was like, flashbacks. They weren't referring to, because when I came back, I had PTSD, and as a flashbacks, it was all of the anxiety. It wasn't just that. It was, they were saying something beyond that. Some were saying that, but the underlying theme of what many people were saying was that I don't feel like I belong anymore. I don't feel connected to anything. I don't feel like I have a sense of purpose anymore. And so there was this deeper social / existential void that was completely being missed in a lot of the research, and some touched upon it, but a lot of it didn't. And it was leading to some bit of a disconnect with veterans themselves who were receiving services from this kind of highly individualized frame of reference, and didn't necessarily kind of connect with them on that level of feeling deeply disconnected in civilian life. And so the injury of transitional injury was meant to highlight the relevance of that social transition itself as being injurious, not necessarily just what happens at war as being injurious.
That makes a lot of sense. I do quite a bit of work with, in this past year, with wildland firefighters, and they actually experienced something similar in the transition from fire season to the off season, and being with their crew and their brothers and sisters, and then transitioning back to civilian or home life can be a big challenge. And so they often report that the biggest challenge is during the off season and not during fire season.
Right, fascinating. I never thought of it from that perspective. And I'm sure this is probably relevant to kind of many first responders in various ways. In terms of the articles I was writing on this, I would have the first responders reaching out saying this completely fits what I'm going through. And I never really, because I didn't focus on those groups, thought of it from those perspectives. But that makes a lot of sense, the way you say it there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I hear it... I've heard it from some Air Guard members who, have spent their career, their 20 years, and then retiring. And there's definitely a sense of that transitional injury as they retire from service, when their whole identity and career has been wrapped up in it. So, and in retired first responders as well, I've heard quite a bit of that. So I appreciate that languaging and framework.
Yeah, I like the word you used right there, identity, too. I didn't use that word yet right now, but it's certainly a key theme in all of this. Because when you lose a sense of purpose and belonging, identity, you could talk about a self-identity or a group identity or kind of other different types of identities. Social identity, I guess, is the word for that. But I would argue there's not just self-identity in terms of labels you use for yourself, and social identity in terms of the groups you identify with, but something that I talked about, which is role identity. It's you develop an identity from the role you play within a specific group, which is connected to purpose. And so it's not just identity as a category of labels that you acquire in this knapsack of labels of I'm part of this group, I am this type of person, but it's a deeper, more of an existential level of thinking of identity. And I think that connects a lot with the first responders and veterans that we're referring to here.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you'll talk a little bit more about belonging too, and like more depth in that, because, or what you heard from the veterans that you interviewed about their sense of belonging while they were in service versus what it's like in civilian life.
Well, I have a lot of quotes on this, but in general, it was a sense that they were, I guess, a part of a group that everyone had their backs, and they could trust the person next to them with their life. And that sense of belonging, it's hard to recreate that. I mean, perhaps impossible in many ways, and outside of those life or death situations. And so coming back to a civilian life where they feel like they don't really connect with the types of issues people are talking about. Like, someone complaining about, the traffic and how they are so mad at, this seemingly insignificant thing. And just not feeling like they can really relate to these people anymore. And I don't know, I didn't follow up, so I don't have a longitudinal perspective on this, whether there was a readjustment in certain ways that made it less frustrating. But certainly coming right out of that context and into civilian life, there was like, how can I be friends with these people even? Many people were saying stuff like that. So that's part of what I was referring to.
Yeah, and this, there's that depth of connection as far as being able to feel seen and heard and valued, but to know and be known, but not to be able to meet each other on the same level because the stressors that they faced, right? These life or death stressors, experiences, the things that they took in versus, traffic being a stressor at perhaps even the same level. Like how do you connect on those two levels?
Yeah.
I just don't, it probably takes some time or you don't, you connect with the people that you served with.
Right. Yeah. And I'd be curious to follow up with some of these people, actually, now that I think about it, of whether that changed or in some ways, not fully, but if there's some way that, people can learn to adapt. But yeah, when I was speaking with many of these people, it was very shortly after they were coming out. They were all veterans of Afghanistan. So it was quite topical at the time, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know how we connected was because of your writings on sanctuary trauma. So I'd love for you to talk to us about this theory also.
Yeah, it was actually a concept that came out of one of my interviews with one of the veterans that he actually told me that he attributes at least half of his trauma to his interactions with Veteran Affairs after coming out of the military. And that stood out as quite striking. And he told me that, there's this concept called sanctuary trauma developed by Dr. Stephen Silver. And I really kind of delved into that after that because there's not a whole lot written on it. I wrote an article called What is Sanctuary Trauma? And I guess it tends to rank well because there's not a lot of literature on it. And it's almost, a forgotten concept that I think perhaps should be brought back and revived because it explains a lot of stuff that's within this realm of transitional injury that I was referring to before. So if transitional injury is kind of the umbrella, this might be like a subversion of that, I could argue. And it's specifically looking at coming into an environment that you expect to be safe and therapeutic, and getting the opposite. And so I guess it's expecting a protective, supportive environment, but only discovering more trauma. And it amplifies that because of your expectation. And it's like, if you're expecting the safety here and you're not getting it, where are you going to get it? And that being the case it was really developed with veterans coming back from Vietnam. And prior wars, you can imagine like how it would be different than the veterans coming back from Vietnam, because there was celebrations. We're all on the same team. Everyone, you're heroes for this cause that we can all rally behind. Vietnam being very different in that it was a very divided, contentious war, where a significant chunk of society was not behind it. People were protesting it. Not everyone was rallying behind the military at that time. And a veteran coming out of that and into a social context that was like that, it was like you expect to feel safe and secure and supported at home. But when your home is really feeling quite contentious and politically fraught, and that people are not so much on your side, there's a different layer of rejection or I guess you can say sanctuary trauma that occurs there. And in the case of my own research and how it was relevant for Afghanistan, did come up in terms of navigating the institution of veteran affairs. That's kind of how it generally came across. There wasn't kind of that same 1960s level of societal disconnect around it and protest. And so it was seen as people expecting to get this massive support and ease of services, and just feeling like just accepted and supported, but really just having to fight the veteran affairs and fighting the bureaucracy. Not everyone had this experience. Some are easier than others, but some really did. It was like a second battle for many of them that I spoke with, where the massive bureaucracy of that was quite frustrating. And so that would be how the sanctuary trauma perhaps comes in that case.
Mm-hmm. And it makes me think of police officers today. There could be some sanctuary trauma there. Right.
Well, I guess that's where the political side of it comes in, because it's going into harm's way and not fully feeling rallied behind by the society at large regarding, I guess, the defund the police and some of those calls for that. And no, I could see the overlap there.
In our first season, we interviewed a police officer's wife who spoke about really this feeling of being unsafe in her neighborhood. So they took all the stickers, that said they were police officers off their cars. Really, she lost friends on Facebook, and it was at an extraordinarily challenging time. It was right after the murder of George Floyd, and this was in Las Vegas, and she spoke about that and the trauma and the challenge of losing friends and not being able to really be who they are in their neighborhood.
Wow. Losing friends in terms of in service?
Losing just friends because of political views and
okay.
Defund the police. And,
right, not just, I guess, Okay.
Yeah.
So, wow, it's quite significant. And so, feeling that you're put into highly compromising situations where there are actual life and death scenarios like the military, but again, not having that feeling of full support. There's a real parallel there. And in the military, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of unlimited liability.
Mm-mm.
It's this idea that you are really, unlike any other job, expected to kind of get to the point where you give up your life potentially. And I guess it kind of overlaps with policing, but not fully. And there's something different in the military that's beyond just kind of a contractual obligation, where it's like, okay, this is the contract, you fulfill the obligations, and there's health and safety parameters. Like in normal workplaces, you burn your finger, there's a report to write up. Like, none of these things should happen. You should never be harmed in your workplace. But it's very different when you were looking at kind of the first responder context, and especially the military context, where it's almost expected that there's going to be many casualties. And there's something there that's outside of, I guess, normal liability terms. Your liability is limited. In this case, there's something, I guess, veterans would call there's a sacred obligation that they would say the government and the society at large has when it sends people off into those situations. And the Canadian government I'm from Canada, and so I was looking at how the Canadian government was actually using that language of sacred obligation, and that we have a sacred obligation to our veterans. And the interesting thing was that it wasn't kind of being met. And many veterans were kind of clinging to that language and saying, well, look, you send us out into this situation where there's unlimited liability, life or death scenarios, and you say there's a sacred obligation, but then we don't feel supported and feel rejected after that. And if you look at the word sacred in sociological terms, it really is centered around social integration. Sacred things are things that we all rally around, like the flag, for example, or religious sacred objects, where we would kind of in like Mecca, we're circling around this thing, and Emil Durkheim talks about the concept of the sacred as in sociology as binding us together. And so when that sacred obligation, when they feel like it's not met, there's a layer of rejection and isolation that goes kind of even deeper than what I was referring to before. I don't understand these people who are complaining. It's more than just not feeling connected to civilians. It's a real deep rejection in this kind of sacred sense of not feeling supported. And I guess the word sanctuary, if you look at the etymology of that, it's rooted in the word sacred. And sanctuaries are really historically sacred spaces, like churches. And so when you feel like you should be coming back into this kind of sanctuary or sacred space with a government or society that has a sacred obligation, and you don't feel like that's met, that's kind of the core of sanctuary trauma, I guess. How's that
makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I appreciate the context there of the language. That's helpful.
Right.
So I'm curious, how is sanctuary trauma, if at all, connected to moral injury?
Right. Yeah. And that's the term that really kind of took hold recently. And it's something that I was really researching in the early days before it was really kind of taking off. And out of, sanctuary trauma or moral injury just kind of really developed. And there's two aspects of moral injury. There's kind of doing something in combat or a high stakes situation that you come to realize you don't agree with, like accidentally killing a civilian, and then feeling kind of highly morally conflicted about what you did. There's extreme guilt and shame. Another version of that is kind of similar, but kind of witnessing something like that happening. I guess so. You see something that is like a genocide, for example, and you witness the inhumanity of that, and so that's kind of, those two are things, witnessing or being a part of things that are morally fraught. And then I guess the different version of that, the second version of moral injury, is institutional betrayal. And that's the sense that in a high stakes situation, you feel betrayed by an institution that you trusted. And so it could be a superior or a part of the bureaucracy kind of ordering you to do something that you know or feel is wrong, deeply wrong, but you feel betrayed by kind of a system that's out of line with its stated values or your values, and that version of moral injury can resemble sanctuary trauma in many ways, because you felt like this was something that you were part of. Everyone was on the same page, and then that morally conflicting situation happens, and then you like, it's like, what am I a part of now? And so that would be kind of the overlap there. They're both, I guess you can say, social concepts. Sanctuary, the sacred, as I was saying before, but morality, moral injury is based on morality. Morality is a highly social thing as well. Again, Emil Durkheim, sociologist, talks about morality as that again, which binds us together, our social contracts, I guess you can say, with one another, and our expected behavior, and so with that being broken, it's kind of another social injury of feeling highly disconnected. And it can result in a lot of shame in many ways. And the source of shame is a deep sense of not just guilt, where you feel bad about something you did. Shame would be that deeper pain of feeling like you are bad and are ostracized or disconnected from society. So it's a really thwarted belongingness that happens there, and all of these things is kind of how I connected it back to suicidal risk, of the interpersonal theory of suicide being two risk factors: thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. And so when particularly that belongingness factor, that you feel deeply disconnected, and there's different ways you can rationalize yourself as a burden despite not being one. But these are the things that connect to suicidal ideation, and they're very different. It's a very different way into looking at suicidal risk than just kind of war trauma, flashback, PTSD kind of lens.
Mm-hmm. I have a colleague, Dr. Stephen Nicholas, who wrote a book called Living Ideation, who shares a lot of your perspective, and as a way for suicide prevention, really focuses more on strengths and having people reconnect with purpose, as well as that sense of belonging and who are their people who matter in their life.
Love it. What's the name of that again?
Living Ideation.
Living Ideation. I have to look that one up. Nice.
Yeah, you might find it interesting. As you talk, there's several words that kind of stuck out to me. The sacred, belonging, shame, and really what it kind of boils down to is this loss of humanity in a way,
yes.
or as disconnection from our humanity, because there's not a loss, but there's a disconnection from our humanity. And I'm curious if that came up at all in your interviews, or...
It's for sure a theme, and a lot of, I guess the one time I can think of this is there, not in my interviews, but with a Canadian veteran, Romeo Dallaire, who led the campaign, I guess, with the UN in Rwanda, and he talks about just witnessing the atrocities and the inhumanity of that genocide in Rwanda, and just in witnessing the inhumanity, there was I guess the result being a moral injury. It wasn't a common term in my actual research, but I can apply it by looking at the concepts before: the sacred, expecting to feel like you're belonging, and this relates to a social critique by Max Weber, another sociologist, that talks about how the bureaucracy really is the core of modern institutions and the way societies function. And we came out of this space of kind of sacredness to something that's more underlying, I guess, instrumental rationality is the word he uses for it. It's kind of the movement. Bureaucracies are really large scale movement of objects and not kind of humans and persons. And it takes the humanity out of many things. And so if you look at the military, it's a perfect combination of these two things, kind of an institution with historical, and you can go back to the Greeks and the Romans and how it was talked about. There's a ritual component to it. And you can look at, all the stories and Achilles and all of that. But, the military in the modern times is both this kind of sacred / ritualized historical institution operating in a massive bureaucracy. And veteran affairs is just the definition of that, just massive bureaucracy, where it's kind of by necessity as well, because how do you manage these large flows of bodies? And there's kind of this necessity to it, but it also strips the humanity out of the transition in many ways, because you go from being a part of this thing to being an individual. And if there's a problem, you get a diagnosis, and a diagnosis is an individualized thing as well. And so, really feeling that difference between the kind of the sacred belonging aspects of the military and then the kind of bureaucratic aspects of it, which are quite different, and it's quite a jarring transition to experience both in that way.
Yeah, it makes me think of an example that's not with veterans, but with healthcare providers. And I, in a previous role, would sit in meetings with administrators, and the way that they often talked about physicians, and sorry to any healthcare administrators, but the way that I heard them speak about them, it was as if they were talking about robots. Or it's like chess pieces. And so that's like the bureaucracy that you're speaking about. But, you have this practitioner who's trying to see X number of people, and you have administrators making decisions about how you're seeing these people. And so there's this interesting loss of humanity for the providers as well as for the patients that you see that definitely impacts patient care, but also provider well-being.
That's fascinating. I never thought of it from that lens. And it's the provider side as well. And I guess I have thought about it in the context of healthcare, having worked in healthcare myself. Canadian healthcare system, I guess it's a little different. The main problem, I don't know what the main problem is. I know there's just different things about insurance and all that. But in Canada right now, particularly Ontario in my context, the main problem being funding. It's been relatively starved for many years, and the long wait times. Again, we don't pay for vast majority of healthcare, but it's really quite frustrating to get any kind of immediate service. You won't get any. There's a lot of waits, and that leaves a lot of the staff highly stretched. And having experienced part of that, working in it, you try to do the best you can, but you're spread thin. You're just kind of talking to people with like very fast, rapid pace, minimal amount of contact with people. You're throwing forms at them, filling them out, filing them away, running to the next thing. And this is in a therapeutic context. I'm talking like where people are coming off of hard substances and they need a lot of care, and one would argue sanctuary and just support. And so it becomes really a revolving door in many ways of just like do the dance, move the people, move on. And it's that pressure of not having enough support to actually spend the time that you would want. And it takes your own humanity from the whole situation in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's these large bureaucratic systems that really dictate so much of that loss. It's unfortunate. And I don't know how to fix that. I don't think we're going to fix that today, but
right.
I think it's interesting to at least, have the conversation about it, be aware of its impact on people.
And because it does relate to sanctuary trauma, it's not necessarily just relevant for veterans. But if you look at people who are struggling with addictions, who find themselves in one of these overstretched systems, expecting like, okay, I'm going to finally do something. I'm going to finally go to the thing that I've been thinking about for years, but haven't been able to do. And they get themselves into this system, and then they experience this like disconnection. Like, wait a minute, I don't feel completely supported. This person is looking stressed out and talking to me right now. Like, I don't know. We see this a lot in nursing. And if you go to the hospital and they're just running around, I don't know. I have this like image of the U.S. healthcare system as being well staffed for some reason. I don't know this, but at least in Canada, people are stretched thin, and so it looks like they're just kind of jaded and kind of cold, but really they're just coping with what they've got. And so the sanctuary trauma would happen if somebody's coming into a healthcare system, whether it's addiction or even mental health, like going to a psychiatric ward or some kind of residential treatment, and really experiencing not getting supported. And oftentimes people kind of just leave or just and be even more hopeless, because at least when they weren't going because they weren't quite ready yet, there was some kind of hope. And now when you go and you experience, oh wait, this isn't going to do anything, it's making me worse, there's some loss of hope there that's quite detrimental. And so the place that people are supposed to get feel supported and they don't, this concept of sanctuary trauma does seem relevant there as well.
Mm-hmm. I just actually spoke with someone yesterday who was going through an addiction treatment, working with a therapist, and the way that office particularly runs is they don't see people long term. And this individual wants ongoing therapy because they're continually exposed to trauma as a first responder, and really just want to do it as a preventative measure for the future, but is getting discharged from their therapist. And so this place that was, has been a source of healing is then saying, okay, we've got to move you along, which makes sense for capacity and all these things,
right.
But then actively wants to continue seeing somebody as preventative because they see the impact of their work. So it's just a prime example of that.
Oh, for sure. What a morally conflicting position to be in as a practitioner, where it's like you've been there long term, and then you have to say, okay, good luck. And yeah. It's hard.
Mm-hmm. In the beginning, you mentioned that so much of your work focuses on the power of social connection. And how do you see social connection being relevant to trauma?
Right. And I guess I follow kind of the similar perspective of Gabor Mate on this, the Canadian physician, addiction medicine physician I'm sure many people are familiar with. That
we actually just interviewed Daniel Mate on their new book that they published. Yeah, The Myth of Normal.
It.
Yeah,
just
great
finished
book if
it.
you haven't read it yet.
Yeah. No, yeah. Downloaded the day it came out and finished it up fast. So great book. Fascinating. And so that's exactly that same perspective. Not looking at trauma as kind of that, just the big T stuff, like natural disasters, war, being assaulted. But the small t and complex traumas that are more subtle and a form of disconnection, one can argue, as Gabor Mate often states, a traumatic childhood could mean sacrificing your authenticity for connection. And so there's a need to disconnect from oneself in order to feel connected to perhaps their family or whatever system they're part of. And so it's always kind of a fragile connection too, because deep down like this connection's conditional. So and then it's not even true connection. It's a disconnection. And so living and coping in these ways for, in a long-term sense, you develop certain strategies as a child and you carry them to adulthood where you're relating to people with similar learned psychological muscle memories, I guess you can say. And whether it's like a mask wearing, people pleasing tendency that disconnects you from yourself and your own needs, or whatever else, there's a deep disconnection there that doesn't look like that person is. You're not looking at someone who's sitting alone, isolated, and not leaving their house. You could be looking at someone who is highly social, but deeply disconnected, and you would never see it. It's kind of an internal sense of being disconnected, and so I guess that trauma-informed perspective is not so much what's wrong with you, why aren't you happy, everything's going great. It's more like what happened to you that's leading to this current feeling today, and that's kind of the trauma-informed lens that I take.
Yeah, and I'd love for you to speak some more about the small t traumas and that disconnection that's seen. I hear a lot about that in the first responder communities, especially, there's high rates of divorce or separations, and there's a lot playing out there with small t trauma.
Right. Yeah. What I'm curious which ones that come up for you, the specific traumas that you're referring to.
I think it's that sometimes when people go home, that's the hardest place to be, because the relationships at home are strained, and there's a disconnection. I think of stereotypical, people are in the same room, but both people are on their phones, or both partners are on their phones, or kind of that ship's missing in the night, or whatever that term is.
Yeah. And I'm curious what's leading to that disconnection. And I guess you have more experience with first responders personally. Would some of that be? Would it be like having to operate in this almost militaristic type of way, shut off the emotions, get it done, instrumental way of being during the day, and then having to switch at night, which is different than the military, I guess, unless you're a drone operator. But the benefit of being in the military is that you're one way, and then you transition back, and then you kind of try to focus on being another way. But this having to switch it on and off, it sounds like it might be part of the difficulty there. Is that your sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's, it really is like a light switch. It feels like going on and off. Like, okay, I'm putting on my uniform. I've got to be this way today, and then going home. And so it's about transition, right? Like that, having that transition. I've heard some people talk about it in warrior culture, and that we've lost that sense of transition between when I'm a warrior and when I'm at home. But historically in warrior cultures, there is a transition that happens. And so somehow we've lost that.
That's exactly. It's what I was referring to earlier. I think it's Jonathan Shea talks quite about that and the loss of ritual and that whole transition component. And especially, yeah. So if your day job is, turn off the emotions, go into metaphorical, I guess, combat in whatever it is you're fighting or having to do that day, and then to switch it off, turn on the emotions again, it's easier to just leave the emotions off, I could imagine, and therefore perhaps leading to a sense of disconnection among partners and perhaps children. Is that part of it right there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know for sure. I'm not an expert in that area, but
Right.
that with the people that I speak with, that seems probable.
Right.
And that loss of ritual, yeah. And it really does just become easier to turn off the emotions or to keep them off.
Right. Because if you look at it, would it be easier to keep the emotions on and bring it into your work, or just turn them off and then just be more instrumental at home? And I think the second one sounds more feasible in the short term, but leading to long-term consequences in the home life for sure. Yeah. Because home life, I mean, is kind of that, in some ways, the sacred space, one could argue, and historically as well. That, So I'm just trying to connect the concepts a little bit here.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And if that home life, like going back to that sanctuary space, right? Like if that home life is not safe and you don't feel supported or connected, then that can be really challenging.
Right. No, for sure. That's it. Exactly.
So I know you've been a clinician for the last several years. I'm curious if, since our season is also focused on secondary trauma, do you experience secondary trauma as a clinician? And if so, how do you deal with it?
And so I've been very fortunate to not experience it. And so I really am not the person to be giving advice on how to manage it. And I guess part of that is being very fortunate historically, and not having been through significant traumas, perhaps even big or not really as many small as well. And having, I guess, secure attachments historically, it just kind of made the type of work I do relatively easy. And I can talk to people from a very compassionate lens without kind of having the stuff really stick. And so it's like a Teflon, but not like a militarized, I'm turning off my emotions and doing therapy that way. For some reason, it just works quite naturally with my way of being. And that's really all I can really speak to, is that it just kind of works. Now, if I was going into heart surgery, probably not last a single minute and faint on the floor. And so there's certain things that people can do and can't do. And so in many ways I've found a niche that works for me, because many others completely wouldn't. And so that's the best way I can answer your question. And maybe self-care as just a general piece of this. And so this would be, I guess, if somebody was asking for advice because they were experiencing that, the most general kind of advice is usually caring for yourself, putting your, the whole stereotype or metaphor of putting your oxygen mask on first and all the rest of it. I almost don't want to say it because it's just like we hear these things so many times, but that would be kind of my answer in the absence of any other specifics.
Well, I think I just want to highlight what you said. Like, you're able to be with people, you have your own emotions, and then you don't, you have a way of not allowing that, kind of residue to stick with you. And that you have, it sounds like, developed, some self-care strategies around that.
Yeah, you got to take care of yourself first. I don't go into counseling sessions kind of feeling distraught and uncomfortable, I really tried to kind of eat, sleep, supplements, like doing whatever I need to do to feel extremely comfortable, like whether it's having the room a certain temperature, as I was doing before this interview. Like there's a lot of like checklist stuff that I'm pretty meticulous around that really leads to now I feel comfortable, I feel settled, I feel centered, and then kind of going from there.
Yeah, and all those pieces allow you to show up for the people that you're treating.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So as we wrap up today, is there anything else that you feel is important for our listeners to know or understand?
Yeah, kind of what we're saying this whole time, never underestimate the power of social connection. And it doesn't necessarily have to look like social isolation as someone just not leaving their house. It's subtle things like someone who's learned to sacrifice their authenticity for belonging, but really doesn't feel true belonging. The trauma-informed perspective of these kind of disconnections, often rooting in childhood, and related to veterans and first responders. When you see someone doing something very strange, I guess in general, it's not like what's wrong with you. It's, well, what's happened? And not just what's happened one time to you, like a big T trauma, but what is happening right now? What system are you a part of that's causing this disconnection? Whether it's in, healthcare providers, not just what happened to you yesterday, it's what's been happening to you over the last few years of you operating in this system. And so it's kind of a way of looking at it from a more this complex trauma version of the time extended version of it. So it's trauma informed, but looking at social connections and the systems that people are a part of as really informing what might be going on under the surface.
I love this, what's happened, and looking at it from a longer perspective. I was in a peer support training where a corrections officer who was leading the training said that it takes about 7 years to actually feel the impact of the job is what they find. And so looking at, kind of the culmination of stressors and traumas and witnessing other people's distress, it can take time for that to actually have an impact. And it's kind of this, it makes me think of like a chronic disease, kind of this slow, insidious thing. And then all of a sudden we're like, wait, what? And so
that exactly. It's something I'm also mindful of, because I'm like, okay, I'm doing all right now. Let's give it another 10 years. And so I'm keeping an eye on that as well, being mindful of, is it just a small enough thing that is not noticeable yet, and always being skeptical of that, because these things don't just happen. Well, they can happen overnight, but most of the time they're happening, as you're saying, in this time extended way of kind of being grinding down someone's really mental health in the long term.
Well, and as you know, since you read Dr. Gabor Mate's book, he actually talks about that, being 70 years old and being in a place where he realized that the impact of, all of the trauma work he had done that he was carrying with him. So really interesting to think about.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Steve, it's been a joy to talk with you today. I really appreciate everything that you've shared with us and our conversation. So thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. It's been good talking with you.
Thank you for listening to CASAT Conversations, your resource for exploring behavioral health topics. We hope you found today's conversation timely and meaningful. Please share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. If you want to learn more, visit us at our blog at CASATOnDemand.org.
CASAT Podcast Network. This podcast has been brought to you by the CASAT Podcast Network, located within the Center for the Application of Substance Abuse Technologies at the University of Nevada, Reno. For more podcasts, information, and resources, visit CASAT.org.